Hello, everyone. Welcome to your first online Drugs in Canada class. Before we get going with the content for this session, I just want to do a few housekeeping items. So the first of which, remembering, of course, because I've been called away to a conference this week, the reason for the course being online is due to my inability to be available during our regularly scheduled class time. So what I ask is that you review this lecture posted on DC Connect. And then based upon this lecture, I will have some participation questions that'll be done. If you have watched the lecture, you should be able to answer all of the questions with relative ease, and then ultimately earn the marks associated with this exercise. And secondarily, for your final quiz, there are only 3 chapters on this, and so this will be part of the 3 chapters in addition to your guest speakers that will be covered on your final quiz. So please do make sure that you cover the content from start to finish, as this piece of material will be front and center on your final quiz. So before we get moving into the content for Chapter 8, you'll see I've got Week 10 on the bottom. We've actually shifted this content in terms of our order because we were fortunately able to have 2 guest speakers in to visit our class who ultimately have pushed our content back about a week. So this is taken from what was originally planned in Week 10, but comes from Chapter 8 of your textbook. And so if you would like to follow along in your text, that's where you can find the content for this week. So before we get started, there's a few things that I want to make sure we cover in this lecture. And the first is understanding and recognizing the different purposes for which drugs are used. And there are a variety of different purposes. Many of us are often too familiar with, for example, the functional reason of using drugs, getting high, but there are a variety of other different functional reasons, including dealing with pain. Pain management is a big one. Coping with challenging life circumstances is another big one. There are also dysfunctional uses, for example, staving off the symptoms of withdrawal that all too often come with drug addiction. And so we'll unpack some of these a little bit later into the content. The next thing that I want us to be able to do by the end of this talk is to understand the connections between the motivation to use drugs and the effects of these drugs themselves. Gone are the days when we simply believe that people are drug addicted slaves and who ultimately only use to be able to stave off the symptoms of addiction. We understand that the vast majority of users are in fact recreational, and so as a result, the motivation to use drugs is inherently different from the drug's effects on the individual. The last thing that I want us to do is to understand how the perceptions of individual users help to shape our understanding of the notion that drugs are being used functionally or dysfunctionally. So before we delve too much into that, I want to talk a little bit about the context for our understanding of drug use. And so as I mentioned briefly on our first slide, the vast majority of drug users do never become substance dependent. And this is a really important thing to put a star next to, because although it seems common sense to us, traditionally a lot of our responses to the whole issue of a drug problem have been based on the notion that the majority of users are in fact addicts, when that is incredibly untrue. In fact, if we think back to our very first week of class, almost every single one of us raised our hand when we started talking about whether or not we were a drug user, because many of us used substances which ultimately we lumped in with our definitions of drugs when we think of things like caffeine, when we think of things like cough syrup or other over-the-counter medicines. These are all drugs, and so the vast majority of us never do in fact become chemically dependent, and that's true even when we're talking about illicit drugs like, say, for example, marijuana, cocaine, or heroin. So the second thing that I want to emphasize around this whole idea that the majority of drug users never do become dependent is in fact that the vast majority of users, in fact, only ever experiment with a drug once. Generally speaking, most of us never actually even persist in recreational use either. In terms of people who do use drugs more consistently, recreational users are the largest group, but in fact, probably the largest group, period, is people who have tried a drug, but for one reason or another ceased to use that substance on a long-term basis. So the next thing that I want to talk about is psychoactive drug use in particular. And before we talk about psychoactive drug use, I just want to give you a quick definition of psychoactive. And psychoactive basically refers to any drug or chemical which affects our mind. And so we're talking about the impacts of drug use on cognition, and this is tied directly to their effects. Oftentimes, psychoactive drug use can in fact be functional. It's not necessarily just done for recreational purposes. There are a variety of different reasons people use psychoactive drugs or substances. One of the main ones that I can think of is the person who uses a psychoactive drug in one form or another to have an otherworldly or out-of-body experience. So we're thinking about, say, the shamans or the witch doctors or the kinds of people who use psychoactive substances. In fact, this is something that's been used traditionally in a lot of First Nations cultures to have some sort of a connection with the spirits or have some sort of a connection with an out-of-body or otherworld experience. Oftentimes, we also see this in Western cultures for the purpose of inducing creativity or overcoming some sort of a mental block. So, for example, artists do this quite a bit, where they will use one psychoactive substance or another to help them to become more creative. Musicians are another group that tends to do this fairly consistently, where they will use one psychoactive drug or another to help them become creative and be able to write and record a song in one shape or another. Generally speaking, most drugs are used in moderation. And so when it comes to understanding the context into which we're speaking about drugs as tools or drugs as being functionally used, it's really important to recognize that the vast majority of drug use is either A, moderate, or B, stop before complete control is lost. And so when we're talking about moderate drug consumption, the vast majority of us never actually come even close to overdosing on a drug, which would be a completely dysfunctional way of operating. Generally speaking, we use enough of a drug to experience whatever desired results we're looking for, and then we cease using it. It's the same with alcohol. Very few of us become intoxicated to the point of blackout every single time we use alcohol. And this is setting dependent as well. Generally speaking, even if this is something that you choose to do when you're using alcohol recreationally, it's not something you see happening for the vast majority of users on a consistent basis. Usually this is relegated to a party or to a weekend or some sort of event like that. Now, generally speaking, when we see drugs being used in moderation, we also see users ceasing before the drug causes them to lose control. And we see this as functional or as a way of using a drug as tools, because these users ultimately seek to maximize the benefits they reap as a result of using their substance of choice, while producing or reducing, the possibility of negative consequences. So some of the benefits that users would seek to maximize would include things like relaxation. For example, having that drink of alcohol after you come home from work. Productivity is another one. Using that stimulant in one form or another, whether it's caffeine, coffee, Red Bull, or whether it's something a little bit more frowned upon or taboo, such as Ritalin or Adderall, to help you concentrate and do well on a test. Productivity is another tremendously popular way in which people tend to use drugs. Performance. This is related to productivity, but oftentimes when we talk about performance, we talk about performance-enhancing drugs as anabolic steroids or other types of performance-inducing drugs. And so if you follow professional athletes, you quite often see drugs being used for this purpose in that area. For stress reduction, this sort of goes hand in hand with relaxation, but that whole idea of losing control or the whole idea of abandoning your life for a moment is something really popular in the research when we talk to drug users. One of the reasons for their use. And improved mood is the last, and quite often you will see drugs ultimately make people very happy. And in fact, some people become this way even when they're using alcohol as well. And so improved mood is one of the main reasons why people, generally speaking, tend to use substances. Now, one of the reasons we look at drug use as being something that's generally speaking fairly moderate is probably because of how our modern workday has helped to contribute to the reduction of the amount of substances used, as well as the time with which we have to consume these substances. Because the average work week is around 40 hours, and because the average person works all but 2 days of the week, we generally have a limited amount of time available to use drugs and to consume them at such an amount that would ultimately cause us to lose control, because we've got to find a way to straighten ourselves out before Monday comes around. Now, when it comes to understanding the different functions of drug use, the main theoretical framework from which we understand this is from the perspective of what we call adaptive orientation. Now, adaptive orientation is basically where drug addiction occurs in response to some sort of failed psychosocial integration. And so, unpacking that a little bit more, this type of theoretical framework views drug use largely as a tool for coping with stressors in one's life. Generally speaking, this views the whole notion of drug addiction even as something that's functional, because you're using your addiction in one way or another to help you deal with some sort of stress in your life. And so if we're talking about heroin users, we understand that this is a group that quite frequently has experienced sexual assault or some sort of physical violence in their lives. And one of the coping mechanisms is the use of the drug itself and the pseudo family that's developed as a result of constant contact with other users. Now, generally speaking, the vast majority of us never actually attain the level of a heroin addict. And for the rest of us, we see one of the functional uses of drugs as being the facilitation of different types of performance. Now, whether that is physical performance, like you would see as being used with an anabolic steroid, or whether that is cognitive performance, like you would see being the benefit of one of the stimulants. Generally speaking, adaptive orientation recognizes that there is some type of functional use for any type of drug. Generally speaking, it views the use of drugs by non-addicted people often for the purpose of some sort of perceived benefit. So for example, using alcohol to relax, or using it as a social lubricant, helping you talk to women. If you've ever watched The Big Bang Theory, you'll see Rajesh Koothrappali. This is one of the main reasons for which he consumes alcohol, is to be able to relieve his anxiety and fear of talking with women or members of the opposite sex. Another example would be, say, for example, using marijuana to relax or help to increase your appetite. These motivations for taking drugs oftentimes also include things that are more functional for us, like, say, for example, pain relief, or to experience detachment, some sort of otherworldly, other bodily experience. But when it comes to understanding these types of functional reasons for use, it's important for us to recognize that most drug users only use their substance of choice if the set or setting is correct. And so that moves us into our second point, basically that the use of the drugs themselves ultimately depends on the motivation of the user and the environment in which they're in. Quite frequently, you will not see people using their drug of choice, even if they're experiencing intense craving, if the setting is not right. So even if I really, really want a beer right now because you guys are stressing me out, I'm not going to go and start opening and drinking a beer because the setting is not right. I'm not going to be able to relax drinking the beer because this isn't the end of my workday. This is only the beginning of it. And you see the same with other users. Typically, this is something you see in the more experienced users, especially. So when we're talking about, say, for example, injection drug users, very rarely will you see an injection drug user taking their substance if they cannot get everything right, because this is such an involved process that requires such an important setting up process. So other major functions we see, social interaction, coping, self-medication, expanded perception, getting high, enhancing your physical appearance. And so for social interaction, we've got the example of Rajesh Koothrappali being able to talk. Coping, we can use our example from Chris Cull. He was coping with the suicide of his father. Self-medicating, so let's say, for example, you've got some sort of chronic back pain. Perhaps marijuana is your drug of choice for coping with that. Expanded perception, that otherworldly experience. So the shamans, the witch doctors are an example there. Getting high, so this is a recreational use. So our example there would be, let's say, a college-aged student enjoying their Friday night. And physical appearance being the last. This can go a number of different ways, but we'll use the example of a person using anabolic steroids to help them become more muscular. Now, being social is one of the main reasons why people choose to use drugs. And in fact, most of what we see in terms of recreational use, in fact, happens in a social setting. Most of us do not go home and light up a joint and blaze just by ourselves. Quite often, it's something we do with a group of friends. That's not saying that it's completely unheard of for somebody to use drugs by themselves. The same way it's not completely unheard of for someone to use alcohol by themselves. But generally speaking, the vast majority of use that we see of drugs happens within the context or within the confines of a social setting. Now, when it comes to understanding the use of drugs and being social. One of the first and most important things for us to understand is that both formal and informal rules govern the vast majority of behavior in these settings. So formal rules that would govern a setting, so let's use the one on the left as our example. So we've got 4 people with drinks of alcohol. They're out in public, they're at a bar. And so the formal rules that would govern this situation would be, say, for example, age of majority. You have to be 19 years old here in Ontario, 18 in Quebec, Alberta, or 21 in the United States to be able to be in this setting and consuming alcohol. That's an example of some of the formal rules. Other formal rules include the fact that you can't be served once you're past the point of intoxication. You can't have drinking competitions. There's a variety of them. That's not to say these things don't happen, but these are formal rules that govern these situations. Now, informal rules that govern these situations are much different. And so say, for example, an informal rule that would govern this situation, it's not codified in any way, and oftentimes they're different within each and every individual group setting. But one example of an informal rule would be that you stick to your own drink. You don't dive in face first and take a sip of one of your peers' drinks. And so this guy in the back right of our picture would not lean forward and have a sip from the glass of wine of the individual in front of him. That's just an informal rule that, generally speaking, governs their behavior. And there's a variety of these informal rules, and these apply to the use of the drugs or substances themselves. So one of the things that you'll notice is I haven't mentioned any informal rules about what you can and cannot drink, or any formal rules about what you can and cannot drink. Some formal rules around what you can and cannot drink relate to, say, for example, what types of substances can and can't be served. You can't bring your own drinks into places like this, as opposed to at your own home where you might be able to do that. So you don't see any moonshine in these pictures. That's an example of a formal rule being applied. An informal rule being applied to the individual substance of choice itself would be, say, for example, you cannot smoke in this setting. Smoking in this setting would be a formal rule. And another example of an informal rule that you might observe in this setting is, say, for example, the type of drink you choose to consume. Guys don't drink the drinks with little umbrellas in them. This is a gender type of rule that's enforced in many of these situations. And again, you see these vary from place to place to place and within individual groups. And the formal rules typically that govern our social situations are probably subject to the most variability depending on the setting in which we're in. Now, when it comes to the use of drugs and being social, generally speaking, private social bonds often relax the enforcement of some of these rules. And so as you're more familiar with the individuals in the setting in which you're in, these rules become less rigid and more flexible and easily negotiated. So as we see on the right, say, for example, we've got a group of peers using their drug of choice in someone's basement of their house, and these people look incredibly familiar with each other. And so some of the rules that we addressed earlier, say, for example, not sharing drinks, are a little bit different within this setting because of the increased degree of familiarity they have one with another. Now, in any setting that drugs are being used socially, quite often it's for the purpose of facilitating interaction. And whether that interaction is around the drug or substance itself or around something else, you see this manifest itself in a couple of different ways. First and foremost, drinking is probably a very, very popular one. Drinking is known to loosen you up, make you less inhibited about some of the things you say, and ultimately have a little bit more fun. This is why you see karaoke bars as opposed to just regular karaoke places, because the vast majority of us would never think of getting up and embarrassing ourselves by sharing our terrible singing voices with our friends. So this is one example of the way which alcohol will be used to facilitate interaction. Marijuana is a really popular one for this as well. Quite often, in fact, you'll see marijuana used to facilitate interaction, and this revolves more around the use of the substance itself. Say, for example, thinking back to your high school days when you and a couple of friends would sit in a person's car and smoke your marijuana in the car and do what we call hotboxing it. This is a very social activity in which we interact one with another, probably listen to a little bit of music, and this focuses namely on the drug of choice that we're using in that individual setting. Now, when it comes to the use of drugs in individual social settings, there's a pretty significant amount of evidence that points towards the importance of set or setting in terms of how it influences how we will experience the type of drug that we're using. Say, for example, you're looking at this bar. If you were to choose to walk to the bathroom and smoke your marijuana in this bar, the impact of that setting is going to influence how you experience your high. You're not going to be as relaxed. You're probably likely to be more paranoid in that situation because you're violating one of the formal rules associated with that place, which is no smoking inside. Comparatively, if you see these teens on the left who are smoking their marijuana, probably going to be a lot less paranoid and a lot more relaxed based on the setting in which they're choosing to consume their drug of choice. And in fact, one of the things that we know from the research is consistently that more often than not, it's not the type of drug that's going to have the greatest influence on the effects you will experience. It's actually the setting in which you're using. And so the situation on the right, generally speaking, is one which lends itself quite well to the experience you'll have with that drug. No better example of this can probably be taken than if we were to look into rave culture and understand how the use of psychedelic drugs in this type of event has helped to shape our understanding of what the effects of those drugs will be. You have loud music, quite often dancing, quite often consumption of alcohol and other substances in these gatherings. And so as a result, the high or the experience you'll get from taking this kind of psychoactive substance is influenced by that heavy music, is influenced by all those lights, is influenced by the peers that you're choosing to spend time with. Oftentimes, one of the things that we don't tend to talk about very much is a bit of a taboo subject is quite often the use of different substances is associated with sexual behavior. And this is particularly true of alcohol. As you start to feel less inhibited as you're using this substance, quite often it leads to engagement in behaviors you wouldn't normally see in an individual, whether that's sexual promiscuity, whether that's getting up and singing karaoke, or whether that's becoming aggressive and violent. We know all too often that, in fact, the use of substances often leads to the increasing prevalence of behaviors that you wouldn't necessarily see exhibited in a person were he or she incredibly sober at that time. So other examples of why people use drugs, and there are many of them. These are just a few of the ones that we're going to look through. But the first one we're going to address is this whole idea of coping. Now, coping in drug use often revolves around this whole idea of illicit drugs, and that's basically a function of our prohibition setting that we have here in Canada. So oftentimes where you see someone using drugs for the purpose of coping, we're talking about illicit substances because generally speaking, when we're seeing people using other types of substances to cope, this is very, very tightly supervised by people from our medical community. And as a result, we don't see the same kind of turning nose down effect that we do when people are self-medicating in this fashion. So the two are very closely related. That's why I've included them on the same slide. Generally speaking, you also see some of these functions of coping with legal drugs as well. So for example, one that you would see consistently would be the use of caffeine in the workplace. Caffeine is a substance that is legal, is permitted in most workplaces, and most workplaces actually being the cause of why workers choose to use this caffeine. Say, for example, because of the high stress nature of a workplace, oftentimes people will choose to use drugs or substances as a result of a need to cope with the cutthroat nature of that business, the cutthroat nature of that workplace. Generally speaking, when it comes to our understanding of this, there's a tremendous amount of disagreement about where the line is drawn between coping and self-medicating. Because generally speaking, a lot of the people who are challenged in life and face situations in which they're driven to use, we see as also being the kinds of people who have some sort of undiagnosed mental health issue and who ultimately use a drug or substance as a means of self-medicating and dealing with this issue of coping. Now, other factors to consider with respect to the issue of coping is often the increasing amount of hours worked and diminished time recovering feed the need for people, so to speak, to use drugs or substances as a means of coping with their challenges. Alcohol and marijuana, generally speaking, are the most widely used, and this oftentimes results in blurred lines between the coping and self-medicating understanding. Now, when it comes to understanding self-medication, generally, self-medication is widely recognized as the use of drugs in concert with mental health issues, and often these harmful substances will provide only temporarily relief from these ailments, while ultimately in the long term worsening the behavior. Generally speaking, adaptive behavior is recognized as being a result of the temporary control gained over one's mental state. So again, often the users of drugs who are self-medicating have some sort of undiagnosed mental health issue that they use drugs to help them address. Generally speaking, this behavior we recognize as adaptive because they're continuing to try to move on and deal with the challenges they're faced with in a way that is as functional as possible. Now, the type of substance that they will choose to use really depends on the severity of the needs and the individual attributes of the user. Some people try and self-medicate with things as light as marijuana. Other people try to self-medicate with things as potent as prescription drugs. It really does depend entirely on the individual, and the individual, their setting as well plays a tremendous role in this. So some people like Chris, for example, would ultimately mix drugs they would use for the purpose of self-medicating or for the purpose of coping. In fact, Chris mentioned that he would use either cocaine or oxys, oftentimes using alcohol and marijuana as well. Now, two other reasons that we're going to address, expanded sensory perception. This is really just a fancy way of saying that oftentimes we associate the use of drugs with some sort of extended ability to perceive ourselves or others. Popular culture is a place where we see this pretty consistently. Oftentimes we'll see it, drugs or substances themselves, again, being used to enhance creativity or help people for creative purposes, like musicians who would write songs, artists or designers who would need some sort of a vision to create their masterpiece that they have in their head or to inspire them from. And so in the bottom, we've got a picture of one rapper who's pretty much constantly high and a very creative individual. We've got Lil Wayne in the bottom of the screen. Wiz Khalifa is another person who makes no sort of attempt to hide the fact that he uses drugs for this purpose. You see this in rock and roll as well. Quite a lot of singer-songwriters will use drugs for some sort of an experience to help them with their creativity. There's a very, very long list of those. Generally speaking, these types of users ultimately seek some sort of a new experience through the use of this psychoactive drug, and that is ultimately the thing that helps to foster their creativity. It's effectively described in the research by People's Narratives as a means of unshackling your brain and freeing you from sort of the confines of your own critical thinking and ultimately moving you towards some sort of a reality where there just are no rules and in which you can be much more creative. Generally speaking, one of the features that we see here is users' desire for some sort of temporary loss of control over their behavior, and this is ultimately, again, likened to that releasing of the shackles on your brain. And ultimately, this loss of control over behavior and perceptions helps them to become creative. So in the bottom left, the second picture from the left, you'll see a picture of magic mushrooms. Cyclobin or magic mushrooms, are a fungus that when ingested and consumed can cause people to hallucinate and experience a whole host of different things. This was the drug of choice, which was popular among witch doctors, among native individuals and sort of traditional healers. It was also very, very common among Norse mythologists who would take these mushrooms in conjunction with alcohol, and they would experience all sorts of crazy visions as a result. On the right, we've got the notion that drugs can be used to enhance your physical appearance. This one doesn't really require a ton of explanation, and it can go both ways. Either drugs can be used for the purpose of appearing razor thin, like you see the woman in the middle of your screen, or they can be used for the purpose of enhancing yourself to the point to which you grow absolutely massive and large and ultimately achieve some of the societal ideals associated with that. So the observation for women, again, is that we see drugs oftentimes used to meet the societal requirement to remain thin. In men, oftentimes we'll see them used for the purpose of exhibiting hypermasculine, muscle-bound ideals. And so this basically relates to the fact that for men, the whole idea is to be ultra-masculine, ultra-big, tough, have no feelings, that kind of thing. And so steroids are often, or HGH are often the drugs that you'll see used to achieve that ideal. Generally speaking, the vast majority of the attention we see around this type of drug use in our society today is where you will see Athletes who are caught using performance-enhancing drugs, whether that is Barry Bonds, whether that is Lance Armstrong. There's a really, really long list of athletes who've been caught doing this type of thing. Models as well. It's less talked about because there are no legal sort of challenges associated with models who will take drugs to stay thin. But the taboo is still there as well, and the idea of improving physical appearance is one of the main reasons why people will functionally use drugs as a tool. And perhaps the one we're most familiar with is getting high. So getting high is basically the expectation that we have of both the effects of the drug as well as the setting that we're in. And it's an incredibly, incredibly subjective experience, as we've talked about a number of times before. The idea of getting high is founded upon the desire to pursue happiness, even through temporary euphoria that comes through the act of getting physically high itself. And so the idea is there's a chemical reaction that happens in your brain while you are getting high, and that sense of euphoria comes from that increased happiness. And as a result, this is one of the reasons why drugs can be so addicting. This chemical release in our brain can be achieved through a number of different things as well, whether that is being incredibly successful on a test, whether that is being incredibly successful at achieving some sort of a physical goal or winning a championship, or even through exercise. Oftentimes, we consider the idea of getting high as a mood enhancement, as a way for us to get happier. This combines a number of different functions of drug use because there are a number of different reasons why someone would choose to get high, whether that is for the purpose of escape, whether that's for the purpose of relaxation, whether that's for the purpose of being social and or coping with some sort of a challenge to your day. Getting high occurs for a number of different reasons. And in fact, one of the ones that I hear most consistently with marijuana would be for the purpose of enjoying music. And in fact, there was a study done in Toronto just a few years ago in 2014, where one of the top reasons for people using marijuana was to be able to enjoy music. And so this is something you see fairly consistently as a functional way of enjoying a drug. You will get high, you will relax, and you will enjoy your music. It's the same sort of thing that we see with alcohol, someone choosing to have their drink for the purpose of reducing their stress or coping with some sort of a challenge in their lives. That getting high can also cover things like self-medicating. So say someone has a really bad back pain and they ultimately choose to self-medicate using marijuana to deal with that chronic back pain. Again, the function of getting high in that case ultimately provides for them the pain relief that they seek. So as they get high, it's that chemical ingredient, that THC, that feeds into their brain and ultimately causes them to feel reduced pain as a result. And so getting high is not just as simple as a couple of guys or girls going out to the parking lot and smoking their joint. It's much more complex than that. So we've talked a little bit about expectation effects already, but expectation effects are one of the things that are really important for us to understand before we can truly say that we have a true grasp of why people choose to use drugs. Now, while addicts often consume drugs in an uncontrollable fashion, in a non-goal oriented fashion, generally speaking, recreational users or self-medicating users are very, very concerned about the setting and the individual expectations they have or the goals they have associated with using the drugs of their choice. Now, when it comes to addicts, this is a little bit different. Addiction follows from the increasing tolerance and corresponding adverse outcomes of using drugs, whereas recreational users often maintain a very, very steady level of drug use. And so, generally speaking, one of the things that we observe is the expectation effects is largely based upon this environment in which an individual is using drugs. And the environment tells us so much about what a person expects to receive from a drug. Say, for example, I'm taking my pre-workout before I choose to go to the gym. The expectation I have of that substance which I'm consuming is that it's ultimately going to enhance my physical ability to perform the exercise which I'm about to undertake. Generally speaking, the same is true for illicit drugs as well. So if we're talking about smoking marijuana and I'm choosing to do it in my car in the parking lot, the expectation effect there is not that I'm going to drive and be fine. the effect or the expectation there is that I'm going to relax, sit back and listen to my music and ultimately just enjoy my time, maybe grab myself a bag of popcorn and just sit back and relax. Generally speaking, addicts are sort of counterintuitive in the sense that they consume drugs devoid of sort of any expectation, effect, or goal associated other than simply staving off the symptoms of addiction or of withdrawal that come as a result. And our example that we've used in this class before are heroin users. Generally speaking, as you increase your tolerance to this type of drug, you don't necessarily see the users seeking to get high as much. Generally speaking, the expectation effect is much, much more reduced to the point where users will just use the drug of their choice for the purpose of staving off addiction and staving off that withdrawal. Generally speaking, they don't actually even experience a high anymore. And so that whole idea of chasing the dragon, needing more and more and more, becomes a really dark reality where they do become ultimately a slave to their addiction. Now, when we talk about instrumentalizing drug use, the whole notion of instrumentalizing requires the user to emphasize that drug use occurs in a controlled fashion. Generally speaking, the controlled fashion refers to the use of a drug in line with their own sort of expectations. And so generally, one of the things that we're talking about with instrumentalizing drug use is the notion of prescribing medications. And generally, most prescribed medications occur in line with this notion of instrumentalizing drug use. Again, we're emphasizing the fact that use only occurs within a controlled fashion. The same way might be observed in someone who's using even illicit substances if they do it in a very regimented way. Now, when it comes to understanding psychoactive drugs and how these fit into our picture, generally speaking, psychoactive drugs are often used very, very functionally for a number of different purposes. These would include things like using magic mushrooms to help combat depression or for some sort of relief of pain. Ecstasy is often used by PTSD sufferers as a means of escape. And this is a pretty new area of research, one that we haven't seen a whole lot of information on. But one of the things that we've noticed is that ecstasy helps to increase that sense of well-being and help to stave off some of the symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. Cocaine has often been used for numbing purposes, as well as for overall gut health. So if you're feeling a little bit nauseous, take some cocaine. In fact, this was one of the medical uses for which cocaine was prescribed in the early days before we started to recognize it had some more addictive capability. Many of the benefits that we see associated with this type of psychoactive drug use, though, are often overshadowed by the notion of conformity to traditional thinking in both the moral and medical side. So generally speaking, one of the things that we see is that with these type of drugs, because they're not heavily controlled in a westernized sort of biomedical way, we don't see their use quite as frequently, even though we do know that when it comes to what we can expect from these substances, quite often it's very, very positive things. So there was a study done a few years ago, and this basically looked at the notion of why people use drugs. Specifically, this one was related to people in Ontario. And so one of the things that we see is while most people actually accept that drinking can be done for relaxation and social purposes, there's still some hesitation to recognize this with respect to other types of drugs. And in fact, generally speaking, this is one of the things that I hear consistently from people who I talk to about marijuana use, is that marijuana also has that same ability to relieve stress, serve as a social lubricant. And as we see above here, one of the main reasons reported for using marijuana is in fact to relax and to enjoy one thing or another. If we combine these two, in fact, the vast majority of respondents to this latest survey ultimately demonstrated this is one of their top reasons for using that drug. Now, some respondents also indicated that marijuana helped to enhance their creativity, sounds like something we've heard before, as well as altered their consciousness and provided them with a more perspective outlook. And so if we're looking at this chart, the top reasons, so 40 of the people who were surveyed, or 77%, said that they, or 77 respondents, said that they use marijuana to enjoy TV, to relax. And then down from there, the next most popular at 66 is to feel good. at 59 to be social, so as with alcohol, as a social lubricant, and then down the list into our 40s to cure boredom, so just smoke a joint because you got nothing better to do, to get inspired, to see the world with fresh eyes, to feel less anxious, which is very surprising for me, as well as to remove inhibitions. Now, some of the least common reasons why people would use marijuana: to get through the day, for medical reasons, as well as to communicate better. And so this is a little bit curious for us. I would have thought medical reasons would be up the list a little bit further, especially with how much we hear about people using drugs for some sort of legitimate medical reason. But generally, maybe one of the explanations for this is because people don't yet understand some of the accepted medical benefits and only recognize medical reasons as if a substance is prescribed by a doctor rather than self-medicating. To get through the day, pretty common with marijuana. In fact, we don't actually know of many people who have what we call marijuana use disorder or some sort of advanced sort of dependence on marijuana. And so very, very few people actually communicate this as a reason why they would use the substance. The other one that's not surprising is as a symbol of defiance. Marijuana has become more socially tolerated and more normalized, and so you don't see it used as in that fashion so much anymore, but to communicate better, and again, seems mostly like common sense to us, as I'm sure the vast majority of us don't become better speakers because of use of marijuana. In fact, we probably are not quite as good as speakers after having consumed, whether it be a joint or in some other fashion, maybe an edible. Now, the top reasons, though, in fact, if we actually combine the top two, because I would see enjoying music or enjoying television as a form of relaxation. Generally speaking, this is the biggest reason why people tend to use marijuana, next to, of course, to feel good, as well as to be social. And so understanding being social is pretty easy. If we look at the picture we had a few slides back, quite often marijuana use does occur in a social fashion. So perhaps I'm choosing to be part of a group, and maybe we all smoke our weed together. And so this would be one way of being social, to feel good. Again, not a surprise. A lot of people associate that feeling of euphoria with the use of marijuana. And the last one's to relax and enjoy music. More often than not, this is something you see pretty consistently, is a lot of people will smoke marijuana and listen to music and just lay back on the couch and be relaxed. And so one of the main reasons, again, is as sort of a means of coping with relaxation. So when it comes to understanding marijuana as medicine, this is something that has been traditionally fairly rejected in our society. In a biomedical system, such as the one we have here in Canada, there's a tremendous amount of resistance to any sort of notion that non-pharmacological drugs could be used in one way or another as true medicine. These are natural substances, not ones that are synthetically manufactured by our pharmacists or by our big pharmaceutical companies. And so as a result, there's a tremendous amount of hesitation for physicians to prescribe marijuana because of a number of different factors, including the lack of criteria, including the pressure from pharmaceutical companies to use their substances, as well as a complete and total lack of research currently being done. Some of the reasons why marijuana is used as medicine would be to treat anxiety or depression, for mental health disorders, to deal with the symptoms of HIV and AIDS. Other reasons, chronic back pain, people who are chemotherapy patients and are experiencing nausea and can't eat. Marijuana, generally speaking, works for them as well. So we see a number of different uses. And again, the one thing to recognize is with marijuana, as with any drug, it's not going to work. It's not a miracle cure for every single ailment. So just because I have depression and I choose to smoke some marijuana doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to experience the same effects as, say, for example, someone else who has that same sort of disorder. Lot of substance use is inherently based on the individual who's choosing to use that substance. And so as a result, we can't really paint with a wide brush. And so the next thing that we note is that marijuana is still generally not prescribed a whole lot by doctors. And in fact, a lot of the people who do have prescriptions for medicinal marijuana come to seek those prescriptions for their own purposes, whether that be I've heard that this is a little bit better than the prescription drugs I currently have to take, or whether that's I'm already a recreational user, and so I would like to see if I can find some way to get my marijuana for free, or to get a prescription for it so I don't have to hide from the police when I'm choosing to smoke my weed. Most academics reject the notion of marijuana as medicine, again, because many users who also use marijuana as medicine use it recreationally as well. And so one of the things that we've seen quite consistently is, in fact, although a person only requires about a third of a joint for pain management purposes, quite often they'll smoke the entire thing just because they actually enjoy smoking their marijuana. And so this is one of the reasons why so many people who do research in the field ultimately reject the idea of marijuana as medicine, because these users who are using it for medicinal purposes are using it recreationally as well. That would be kind of akin to taking antibiotics to cure your strep throat, but also taking them because you liked the cherry coating that was on the outside of them. Not a typically very functional way to use the drug itself, and it doesn't really fit so well with the notion of a medicinal use of drugs. Medicinal uses, generally speaking, require a different set or setting, and ultimately this is one of the reasons why you'll see different people, let's say marijuana users in particular, choosing to use their drug in a different fashion. In fact, many people who use marijuana as medicine don't do it in a social fashion whatsoever. In fact, a lot of people who have medicinal marijuana prescriptions, who truly require it for the symptoms of pain or whatever they're dealing with, will choose to smoke on their own at home and at certain times of the day. Very, very different from traditional users who may choose to smoke in groups with their friends or family or peers. So obviously, we're going to have to shape this discussion question a little bit, but this is going to be one of the participation exercises associated with your lecture for this week. So what I'm asking you to do is to discuss the following questions, and instead of posting your answers on a sheet of paper, I want you to post them to the discussion board. And so I'm going to create a blank discussion board. I ask that you don't post these questions there. This is one of my ways of making sure that you're actually going through the lecture. And the notion that I want you to follow here is answering each of the three questions separately. So first, how do descriptions of marijuana use for coping and recreation overlap? So think of a reason why you might use marijuana for coping. Think of a reason why you might use marijuana recreationally, and think of any sort of overlap that exists between those two. Next, I want you to think of how recreational use and use for coping differ. So the idea that we're coping with marijuana and the idea that we're using it simply to get high. What are the differences? What are some things you would expect to see in someone who's solely using it for the purpose of coping versus someone who's using it solely for the purpose of getting high? And which of these descriptions do you feel best benefits or best fits marijuana use by either yourself or your peers? So I'm asking you to be reflective here and take a look at what your experience is with marijuana and understand a little bit better how that is exhibited as either being used for coping or being used for recreation. And so I'm going to leave this slide up while I take a drink of water so that you can take some time and write down the questions so you can respond to them on the discussion page. And so again, I'm reminding you, please write these questions down, because if not, you're going to have to go through the lecture one more time to see them again and again. Please do not post these questions on the discussion board. The idea here is to see how many people actually watched this lecture all the way through. Okay, so to quickly summarize, generally speaking, adaptive responses to drug use recognize the reasons for use as being some sort of social dislocation related to the individual user themselves. And so the idea here is that when we're talking about using drugs to adapt to changing life circumstances, oftentimes this relates to either the denial of goal, the absence of legitimate opportunities to achieve some sort of a goal you've set for yourself, and oftentimes the response is withdrawal from these situations and ultimately seeking comfort or coping through the use of one substance or another. Generally speaking, instrumentalizing drug use recognizes that drug use is often very, very functional and used for a variety of different purposes. Now, finally, drug user expectations are often influenced by cultural and individual factors, and this ultimately shapes how individual users perceive their own functional drug use. And so just a few quick things before we wrap up. So you've got your discussion board posting. I'm going to post the blank discussion board. It will be open for a period of 1 week. Please respond to all 3 of those questions. The next thing that I'm going to do is under our course links page, I'm going to post a module prepared by the Canadian Centre for Substance Abuse that takes you through the whole sort of legalization process for marijuana. I want you to click through that module. It will take you about 45 minutes, which is the extra 2-hour session of this class. And I'm going to post some questions in a document that you'll have to answer based on that. So for next time we're together, please monitor our course news feed, because I am going to be posting some instructions for our next class session, and you'll be able to receive those there. If there are any questions, you can get me via email. You can use the DC mail function, or you can get me at matthew.hack@durhamcollege.ca.